A lot to cover. Welcome. Hello, everyone. My name is Scott Babwell-Brennan. I'm a fellow with the Decentralized Future Council, which is a new initiative dedicated to advocacy and education for the emerging decentralized web and related technologies. The council focuses on policy in the decentralized web space, especially looking beyond Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. It's a project of the Internet Education Foundation, and we are funded members of the Filecoin Foundation for the Decentralized Web. So we'll be organizing discussions and programming similar to this one on an ongoing basis. In a couple of weeks, for example, on the 19th of October, we'll be hosting a discussion about what the plan is for domain names on Web3. Preview, there isn't one. And we'll be announcing the details of that event shortly. So keep an eye out for that. But today we'll be exploring campaigning with Web3, how electoral politics can use DAOs, NFTs, and cryptocurrencies. Now, I'm going to divide our time today into three sections. First, I want us to talk about how Web3 and decentralized technologies are currently being used by political organizations, specifically as concerns elections, and in particular, the upcoming, as concerns the upcoming midterms. Second, I want us to look forward and consider some of the potential uses of these technologies for future elections. And then third, we're going to reserve some time for audience Q&A, which we'll be doing through the Zoom chat feature. So please use that at the end. But as we go along in the other two sections, if you have questions for the panel, do not hesitate to send them through, and I'll try and keep an eye on the Q&A as we go. We are super lucky to have three fantastic panelists who are working and thinking about this intersection of Web3 and electoral politics, both on the left and right politically. So we're lucky to have first Shrina Khurani is an engineer, an entrepreneur, and a former candidate for the U.S. Congress. She has built and invested in technology companies, most recently as vice president of Republic, and is now the managing partner at Snowcap, a climate tech venture fund. Shrina was the first federal candidate to launch NFTs for her campaign. Also, we have Eric Wilson, who is a political technologist driving innovation and digital transformation in the Republican Party. He is the managing partner of Startup Caucus, an investment fund and incubator for Republican campaign technology startups. And finally, Russell Mindich works on research at the intersection of Web3 technologies and political campaigns at Higher Ground Labs, a Democratic political tech venture fund and accelerator. Earlier this year, he convened an expert working group and wrote a report that provided an overview of this emerging field. He is also a democracy reform advocate, contributing to electoral reform research and campaigns across the country. All right, with that, let's just jump right in. As I said, we only have an hour and there's a lot to cover here. So Shrina, I'd love to start with you. And could you please tell us more about your recent campaign, your decision to integrate and then sell campaign NFTs? And, feel free to take this however you want, but I'd love to hear more about, was it successful? And more importantly, how did you define success for this project? What challenges did you encounter? What held it back? So.
Yeah, of course. Hi, everyone. My name is Shrina Khurani. Really, really excited to be here. And I think there's just so many directions that we can take this. But I think one of the things that we're starting to see, and I think is a big part of the conversation here, and especially when it comes to Web3, is creativity and engagement, right? As we start looking into what the next version of electoral engagement is with our communities, we have to start looking at different ways to actually reach people who currently don't feel represented by our electorate, right? So I think there's one of the biggest challenges that we're seeing, right, as we're talking about getting more young people turned out to vote, as we're talking about making sure that people feel like there's an opportunity for their voice actually to be heard. I think NFTs were a way. I mean, let's again put this into context. So I ran for Congress. Our primary was June 7th of this year, 2022. We kicked off our campaign last year. So it was very much sort of at the peak of the sort of NFT wave that the world is riding. So it is a very different situation from what we're in right now in the crypto space. But it was an opportunity to say, hey, this is a tool. This is something that we can leverage to, for one, bring crypto and Web3, something that I've been working with for years now, it wasn't called Web3, just crypto, broadly blockchain, and actually bring it to politics and make this a little bit more exciting. It doesn't have to be boring, old, stodgy people. It can be something that's exciting. It can be something that you feel like actually represents the future, right? That's the point, hopefully. And I think we really saw NFTs as a way to do that.
Great, yeah, and so how did it work? What was your sort of sense of how it went?
Yeah, so once again, for any of you that have ever worked in campaigns, candidates spend a lot of our time fundraising, right? And so as a first-time candidate who had to figure out more and interesting and creative ways to fundraise, there's the fundraising metric, and you could say that it actually really wasn't successful at all. We weren't able to raise a ton of money. And I think that comes from two places. For one, for everyone who's seen all the NFT drops and launches that have been out there, most of them actually don't go so well because you have to have a community that's engaged. You have to have people that are willing to come in and actually spend money on this. The other piece that I think from the pure fundraising perspective that doesn't work is the fact that because of the regulatory side of what it actually what it means to make a campaign contribution means that people are effectively having to share their identity. They're having to connect who they are and identifying information through KYC to a wallet address. And that's something that a lot of people also aren't willing to do. And so I think there are some hurdles that we're going to have to overcome in terms of getting crypto native people who maybe are already slightly potentially, wary of the current state of politics, to now, for one, actually get excited about a candidate and get engaged, but for another, do the thing that they really don't want to do, which is share their personal information and connect it with what they think is incredibly important information, which is their wallet address, which it is, right? So there's, I think, a couple of these key pieces around the NFT piece purely financially, of if you're just going to look at the financial metrics and what does it mean to actually raise money through this, that it's not just an easy silver bullet solution of, well, you can just launch NFTs and you'll raise a bunch of money. That's not how this works, right? And I think if there ever was that easy solution, we wouldn't really be having this conversation. We'd just all be running for Congress, right? So I think that's not exactly the goal. What I do think does work and was a big part of why we want to do it in the first place. So I've been working in crypto for a couple of years with Republic. I've launched a Republic Note token. I think there's a lot of value in bringing blockchain into the mainstream conversation and really talking about technology when we talk about politics, because currently we are governing technology. And so how do we do it in a way that's better, that's more efficient, that actually allows more people to feel like they're being represented in that future? And I think that's the part that worked really, 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 really well, because it got people engaged, it got people talking, it got the Wall Street Journal, sent a reporter out and did an article, and their question, I got a lot of questions, but a question I got across the board from a lot of big press was, so can you explain what exactly you did? Like crypto, Web3, NFTs, like how does that work? Is that legal? What are you doing over there, right? And I think just being able to have that conversation was so incredibly powerful. And I think in that sense, really leveraging new tools, new ways to engage, whether it's mainstream media or population or whatever, but just to get it more in the conversation worked incredibly well. So if you're just looking at the financial metrics and you look at how much we raised, not very exciting. If you look at the press and the media and the buzz and more people, so many people from our district were saying, wait, I think I've heard of crypto, like crypto.com arena, that was the Staples Center. Like, I think I've heard that before, right? And just being able to have that conversation was so incredibly powerful.
Great, yeah, that's great. And I just want to mark your comment about the regulatory side is something I definitely want to come back to sort of towards the end. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we might chart a sort of path forward on the as far as on the regulatory side. But first,
please feel free. No, I was just going to say, feel free to push and prompt me. Apologies to our audience. It is 3 a.m., 3:11 a.m. where I am right now. So I'm getting my mind to keep working, but please push me if there's like specific points that folks have questions on.
Sure. Yeah, and I'm incredibly impressed that you're this coherent at 3 a.m. I'm not ever this together at 3 a.m. But so Erica, I'd like to turn to you, and in your work as a political technologist and a consultant, I'd love to hear more about how you are sort of integrating decentralized tech into the campaigns that you advise or work on. If so, how? What has been sort of the most successful? What are some of the real kind of practical benefits or real problems that these technologies might address? What don't they really address?
Yeah, well, there are four things that every campaign needs to be doing, right? Which is raising money, as Srina mentioned, getting attention, winning votes, and upsetting the opponent. And so I advise candidates and campaigns that if what you're doing doesn't fit into one of those four verticals, you shouldn't be doing it. Where we are right now with crypto, blockchain, Web3 is the getting attention. So I followed Srina's campaign with great interest because she was so out front about crypto and Web3. That's really how we're starting to see it as I don't want to diminish the importance, but almost as kind of a gimmick or a shtick to get people to tune into your campaign. That's the first step, right, towards getting more meaningful usage. We really have not seen, to Srina's point, a mobilization around the fundraising of this. However, we do know that people within the crypto community are very active in funding campaigns, albeit through a more traditional financial method, right? So on the money front, it's starting to come there. I think if the markets were doing a little bit better, we'd see them more active this cycle. The challenge, of course, of earning votes right now is that the technology is the Web3 technology specifically is still very much in the hands of early adopters, people who have significant technical expertise. We have a hard time getting people to fill out donation forms, right? There are errors all the time. And so there's a lot of work that has to be done to make blockchain technology more accessible to average users before we see wide-scale adoption in politics. Another rule of thumb that I always offer people is that politicians go where the people are, right? That's why they show up at county fairs and popular diners. And until Web3 becomes more of a place for politicians to engage with existing communities, it'll remain in this novel area. I don't want to sound like I'm a naysayer when it comes to blockchain, because I'm a big believer in it. I'm more of a not yet. We're just not there yet. Let's wait and see, but let's start to test some of those boundaries.
Great. And Russell, I'd love to hear sort of your thoughts on this. You recently wrote this fantastic report on electoral politics and Web3. And so I'd love to hear some more about sort of other kind of current use cases that political organizations have found for this sort of a decentralized tech, if any.
Yeah, and thanks, Scott, for having me. Definitely wanted to start by giving Srina a major shout out and all the credit for starting this conversation, at least on the Democratic side of things, in terms of how NFTs can not only be used as a fundraising mechanism, but also most importantly to build community. And partially to Eric's point, I do agree that one of the biggest sort of hurdles right now for fanatics or people interested in Web3 technologies and want to implement them on political campaigns is the lack of accessible infrastructure, and also sort of this complex nomenclature that we've kind of come to adopt, which comes with a bunch of stigma. In terms of accessible infrastructure, I do think we can start to see a lot more adoption if we have fiat on-ramp. So, first time, crypto users don't necessarily need to own Ethereum to purchase a digital collectible. We also need to see custodial solutions, so they don't need to own and maintain their own wallet and seed phrase before participating. And most importantly, I do think that a lot of these sort of buzzwords, like even the word NFT, has sort of stood in the way of progress. And some, at least on the left, are starting to kind of pilot this new term of digital collectibles to kind of get away from the buzzwordiness of NFTs, which I do think has held us back. But in terms of other use cases, Scott, to get to your question on other use cases of decentralized tech, I do think there are a lot of fascinating things happening sort of in the political space, but also adjacent in the social impact space when it comes to DAOs. In politics first, one example I'd like to bring up is HODL PAC, which is a decentralized community governed PAC that specifically contributes just to pro crypto candidates on both sides of the aisle. But the founders there have sort of created this mechanism where in exchange for your donation, you receive some HODL vote tokens, which you can then use to distribute your voting power and decide where the collective fund should be distributed. Another one is Lobby 3, piloted by Andrew Yang, which also raised money through NFTs. And it sort of created this community treasury that's meant to both, make grants for advocacy work in DC, but also to build a community around a set of ideas, sort of charting the path for what Web3 from a regulatory and legislative stance should look like. In the social impact space, there are other examples like ChoiceDAO and DreamDAO, which are using sort of these community governance and sort of collective crowdfunding mechanisms to achieve their social impact focused missions of both advancing access to abortion and fostering the next generation of civic technologists. So I do think there's a lot to be excited about. I share sort of Eric's theory of the case that yes, this will mean something, maybe not until 2024. I do think there's room for pilots in 23, but I'm excited and motivated by what we're seeing today.
Great, yeah. So I have a couple more questions in the section before we move on to sort of talk more about the kind of future potential, and I'll kind of open this up to all three of you, so any of you can kind of jump in here. But I really want to get a sense of what y'all see as the difference between how the left and how the right are embracing or interested in decentralized or Web3 technologies. Do we see a difference? What might explain it if there is one? Is it too early? Yeah, I'd love to, given that we have representatives on both sides, I'd love to sort of get your sense here.
I'm happy to share because I feel like my experience is the most specific to my campaign versus I think Eric and Russell will probably have like a little bit more of a bird's eye view. From my perspective, I think the way that we were really trying to frame it is that crypto should not be a partisan issue. I think that's probably also a bit more of a leftist framing in a sense that like, this doesn't have to be partisan, like this is just what it is. And we just need to make progress on this issue. And it doesn't have to be a left versus right thing. At least that's how we were positioning it in our campaign. I do think at the moment, because it's so early, that we're not necessarily seeing a huge difference in how either side is using it, particularly because of that framing of not wanting to be partisan, but also because I think what we're really trying to tap into here is the fact that the nature of Web3 is grassroots, right? And so if we're trying to take this grassroots aspect of Web3 and tie it into the grassroots nature of a lot of campaigns, then you're really just trying to tap into the fact that this is a value that is shared regardless. The other piece is that I think a lot of crypto natives are also not hyper-partisan. If anything, they're sort of gone in the libertarianism direction, right? Which you could argue is potentially a little bit more on the right side. But it's sort of this other spoke that doesn't necessarily fully speak to either party. And so what we're really coming back to is the nature of the technology, sort of it's a single issue voter in a way, right? And that's crypto. And so the party appeal doesn't really help, but also the approach to it is really that this shouldn't be a party issue. This is something that is the future of technology. This is the future of democratization. This is the way that we could potentially be leveraging the internet as we know it. And I think that's something that sort of supersedes party, but I would actually love to hear Eric and Russell's take on this, because I think potentially it's more around the language, right? So things that we talk about, so things that we prioritize, it's talking about community, it's talking about grassroots, it's talking about democracy and really being able to participate. And I think those are words that tend to be used on the left. But yeah, I'm curious what Eric and Russell have to share.
Yeah, so I think let's separate it into a couple of different categories. So one is implementation of blockchain technology on campaigns, and I think it's too early to tell. Certainly there have been candidates on both sides who have done NFTs, and but basically that's where they've dabbled or been really forward about fundraising with crypto. It could be the case where we see one side really take off. I know Russell and his team are investing in some some applications there that I think are going to bring it to more campaigns on the left. Then we have to separate, of course, the policy issue. And I think Shrina is correct. And I hope she continues to be correct that cryptocurrency blockchain policy is not a hyper-partisan issue where there's sort of orthodoxy on one side or the other. I think where the split comes down is control versus openness. And that does not fall on party lines right now. So I think this is sort of one thing that I've talked with Tyler, who runs HODL about, is, what are the agenda items? And I think, crypto voters or Web3 enthusiasts really need to understand what are their aims. And that's often very difficult in a decentralized movement of what are their objectives, where you certainly have folks in the traditional financial services industry who are very clear about what they want and can articulate those policies.
Yeah, Eric, I think that's right. And in terms of thinking about like ways to sort of bring in, new voters, new contributors, new volunteers into your campaign, I think that conversation really needs to be segmented across both like the crypto native audience, which, as Shrina mentioned, might not be registered to vote. It probably isn't partisan, and if anything, leans libertarian. So there's sort of different strategies and ways of thinking about how to engage that group, as opposed to using these new technologies like digital collectibles, et cetera, to sort of better engage existing Republican and Democratic volunteers, donors in campaigns. But at least what I'm seeing in terms of the breakdown across the aisle right now, agree with Eric in that there hasn't been too many differences, mostly because the candidates that are accepting crypto, that stream of funds represents a very small portion of the total donation pie, and NFT trials have been few and far between. But on the right side of things, Blake Masters is responsible for the most successful NFT fundraise so far. Brought in, I think it was close to $600,000 in a day and a half. So that's something, that's something there. I will partially attribute that to his sort of tech background and network that he appealed to. And on the Democratic side of things, we're seeing, infrastructure come together at maybe a little bit of a faster rate. There's a new platform called Electables right now, which is an NFT grassroots fundraising platform that piloted with the collection with Jared Polis, and recently, just last week, launched a second one with Beto out in Texas. So there is some energy and progress in infrastructure, but I'd say it probably is too early to say one side is handling it better or in a more nuanced way.
Great, thank you all for that. I want to, before the second part, I want to come back to a point that Shrina made a few minutes ago about the different environment as concerns crypto now, as opposed to let's say the beginning part of the year. So how do y'all think that the latest crypto crash has sort of impacted the uptake or interest by political organizations in decentralized tech?
So from my perspective, I don't think it's really changed anything. So I think the people and the candidates and the campaigns who are already talking about crypto before were not the people who maybe they were kind of jumping on the hype cycle. But for the most part, they're people who were genuinely interested in what the potential of blockchain technology could be, right? So if you're okay with it before, you're okay with it now, but you're kind of wondering like what the best positioning is and how you talk about it to continue to sort of stay in public favor, because I think the people who were the naysayers now have their moment to be like, look, it doesn't work, like this is why we don't do this, right? And I think it's easy, or I shouldn't say it's easy, but I think there's an opportunity for the naysayers to sort of gain some ground right now, but I don't think we've necessarily lost anyone. I think even the people who are on the edge are like, yeah, well, we've seen this with crypto before. We've had the boom and bust cycles before. And this is just something we kind of need to ride out. So I don't think it's necessarily swayed a ton of people either way. It's maybe cemented more people and sort of continued to leave some people in the middle. Are more campaigns going to launch NFTs right now? Do I think that's the best idea? Probably not. And to even push back on something that Russell mentioned earlier, I think even the term digital collectible, like what does that mean, right, to a donor? What does that mean to a volunteer? And yes, maybe it's more accessible and approachable than NFT, which is currently just seems like a scam to probably most of the mainstream public. But I don't know if digital collectible helps either, right? So I think there does need to be an evolution of how we're positioning Web3 and crypto and different sorts of tools as an opportunity for engagement. I actually think DAOs, if we can take DAO and turn that into something that's a little more accessible and more approachable, I think that could actually be really powerful. But then it starts to also kind of sound similar to a PAC. And what's the difference between a DAO and a PAC? And how do we deal with that from the regulatory side? So I do think that in terms of losing anyone, I don't think we necessarily lost anyone. I think it's maybe made some people who were already against it a little more cemented and feeling righteous in their position, instead of left some people in the middle still trying to figure out what's going on. I don't think that NFTs are necessarily the best way to go right now. But I don't think that this is the end of, how we're going to be seeing Web3 or crypto or blockchain or whatever we want to call it in politics.
Eric, Russell, either you want to?
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I think what people in the political space who want to implement crypto are kind of suffering from right now is sort of the general public perception and sort of reluctance to separate the underlying technology with the price action of certain cryptocurrencies. So I think the general price action has, of course, discouraged most losing 60-70% from all-time highs or earlier this year. Doesn't help the cause, at least in terms of public perception in the media, but ultimately it has nothing to do with the underlying technologies that I advocate for. NFTs aren't something you buy and sell. It's a technological medium on which kind of anything can be crafted. A DAO is a modern digitally native organizational structure. So to some extent, I think, I'm one of the people who thinks that these technologies are inevitable to, in some way, shape, or form, with words better than digital collectibles, kind of be front and center in our lives. But hopefully it'll happen in a way where you don't even necessarily know that you're interacting with an NFT or a collectible. It's just part of your identity on the internet. 50 years ago, these yard signs were sort of the way that you would distribute and kind of give your endorsement of a candidate to your neighbor. And I think in the 21st century, that's going to be an NFT that's your banner image on Twitter. So I do think that despite what we're seeing and sort of the negative stigma that's kind of pervasive around the space right now, I don't think that's the be all and the end all, and I think this is inevitable.
Yeah,
And
one
I
of the
will
reasons
say-
I think it's gotten quieter around blockchain is because we've gotten through primary season. Talking about crypto and Web3 was a good way to build a coalition within your own party. Now we're on to the phase of the campaign where it's about the differences between the party and getting to that 50% plus one. So I think it is probably a correlation that we've gotten a little bit quieter on blockchain in politics rather than causation.
Shrina, did you have something you wanted to add?
I was just going to add on to a point. I do agree, Eric, as well. But I was just going to add on to a point that Russell made earlier, in the sense that the inevitability also comes with, I think, more and more people are paying attention to politics. More young people, more people who are digitally native are paying attention to politics in ways that we've never really seen before. And the fact that we're online, the fact that more people are able to engage, and the fact that Web3 has been online and has been building tools for engagement, I think is really the inevitability of it. So I think campaigns are at a point where people can get burnt out. We're volunteers, we're donors, and people who are doing call time and calling the same donors again and again and again. People are getting exhausted, and we're sort of tapping out, especially from the fundraising side, donor bases as well. So how do we, especially in a cycle like this, turn to new tools to engage more people and potentially find ways to build more sustainable movements? And I think that's really the opportunity for Web3, is that it's not just we're going to call you when we need you, it's we're going to give you a way to engage with us and continue to engage with us, continue to participate, continue to give feedback, find a new way to have the, your normal town hall meeting. How can we potentially have a version of a DAO or a version of some other, Web3 based participation that actually allows you to connect directly with your representative? I think there's so many more ways that we can integrate, as opposed to just selling NFTs for your campaign.
Great. I mean, that's a perfect transition. So let's go ahead and try and be a little bit more specific now and talk about what some of those possible uses of Web3 might be in political campaigns. Right, like this is something all three of you I know are like thinking about a lot. Right, Shrina, I know it's something you're probably working at a lot in your role at Snowcap. Eric, you wrote about this extensively earlier in the year, and Russell, this was, I understand, one of the kind of key issues for the Web3 working group, which fed into the report that you all released. So whoever wants to start, let's just sort of I'd like to just sort of like let's think a little bit broad, as broadly as we can about like different sorts of uses that we might be able to put to these new technologies.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the obvious low-hanging fruit is around the financing, right? And funding campaigns. Quadratic fundraising is a really interesting mechanism, micro donating. But where I'm excited about, and this is sort of my hope for those who are working on this technology, is when I think it was Russell who mentioned it, when it melts away and we don't realize we're working with blockchain, that's when it opens up for campaigns. I go back to HTML, right? when you had to do your own HTML and do your own servers, it was just for kind of some early adopters, people with technical knowledge. Now anyone can have a website and do a newsletter and put stuff on Facebook and Twitter. We don't know that the technology is driving it. So the quicker blockchain can melt into the background of just being tech, the better. And so there's some really cool things that I think would enabled by that. So one is more ownership of your relationship with a campaign. So right now it is a one-to-many, but if we can get to a point where that dialogue between supporters and candidates is better managed through blockchain better. One example sort of far out there, which is, right now your data is being used by campaigns and other political organizations, and someone else is profiting off of that. Now, I would personally be willing to share more data and maybe even save some costs for campaigns if they were willing to share some of those that value with me. So rather than pay a consultant, they're paying all their supporters to get access to their data for modeling or something like that. Those are the sorts of applications that I think are going to be most exciting, most transformative, where the relationship between campaigns and supporters and voters goes from being a performance to a conversation.
Yeah, and Eric, totally agree with that, and have had similar thoughts specifically around like the data use case, a transparent marketplace where you can grant your own approval of what data you'd like to share, and also sharing that value, also very much in the spirit and ethos of Web3. I'm sort of longer term thinking, less interested in the financing side of things and more in the organizing and community building side of things. And I've talked to Shrina about this in the past, but something I'm particularly interested in finding a way to pilot is like a tokenized gamified organizing program, where an initiative where you can kind of better track and reward participation in a campaign through assigning a either superficial points-based or tokens-based value to different actions you take, like knocking on doors, making phone calls, sending texts, or attending events. Sort of what I see the major problem with kind of political campaigning today is a misalignment of incentives surrounding donors and volunteers. Where if you're a donor and you max out to a campaign, you'll surely get a phone call from the candidate or an invitation to an in-person fundraiser. But if you're a volunteer who knocks on 1,000 doors in the heat of the summer in the lead up to a primary, ultimately what you will get is a handshake from someone closer to my age saying, thank you for your service. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's how campaigns have always run. And people and volunteers will always continue to sort of get involved in a movement, what I see for three reasons of being the change they want to see, impacting local policies in their community, and ultimately to build communities, since a lot of people are lonely, just saying it bluntly, they get involved in campaigns to make friends, and specifically people who think like them and live near them. But I do think through creating some sort of better gamified organizing program, you can kind of ultimately both reduce volunteer burnout and sort of create a better ecosystem overall. So again, just a kind of a far out idea right now where we've seen these sort of combinations of a DAO-like body with play to earn mechanics, which have gotten conflated and messed up with all this recent market action. But I do think the underlying theory of the case still holds, where better rewarding participation in a movement will lead to more sustained commitment.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Russell, and Eric as well. I think that especially from the candidate's perspective, right? There's the two things that you need to do. You need to raise the money to fuel your campaign, and you also need to make sure you're connecting with your community. You have the volunteer base, you're connecting with the voters, you're having the conversations, and you're doing that in a genuine and real way, hopefully, as a candidate who actually cares about the people in their community and their voter base and the things that they have to say. So I think one of the things that I think could be really powerful, in addition to, I think some form of an engagement system for volunteers, something that could actually be really powerful and could potentially translate not only from candidate to candidate, campaign to campaign, but really build almost a national federal network of volunteers, right? And as you start seeing races in other parts of the country, as you start wanting to get engaged in, whether it's from your local House race to now your Senate race or whatever that might be, as someone who is engaged, you are sort of forced to take your own volunteer baggage and find and latch onto a campaign and figure out how you can best help, how you can take potentially really great experience and leverage that for a new campaign. But how do we actually make that easier for volunteers to do? And how do we make that easier for candidates and campaigns to tap into, to say, oh, you have 100 door knocking tokens, that's a lot of doors. Where did you knock doors in Arizona, leading up to the election in 90-degree heat in November? That's incredible. Okay, how do we take that level of commitment and now sort of level you up into the next version of what a volunteer coordinator might be, right? So I think really taking advantage of the fact that we have so many people who are getting so excited and who are so passionate, and take the ability of Web3, of blockchain technology, to integrate that engagement and make it easier for people to do it. So I think Russell has definitely been thinking about this a lot longer and harder in terms of how this could actually work. But I do think that there's so much opportunity on the volunteer side. And then, like I was mentioning earlier, how do we almost turn this into not necessarily a direct democracy, but at least in terms of how do we engage more directly and have more of a real conversation, real-time conversation even with our voters, with our constituents. And I think that's another application that starts getting a lot more complicated, right? Is that just a server that we're all on and there's different channels about different issues and we have these conversations? Is that all that is? Or does it get more interesting? And are there different ways that you can participate? So I think those are the two angles that I've sort of been noodling on, is the engagement piece and in terms of volunteer engagement on the campaign side, but also when you're elected, what does it mean to actually have a real conversation with your constituents and to get real-time feedback on what the issues are and how that might influence your votes in Congress, for example.
Yeah, that's great. And so to me, the sort of lowercase d democratic potential of these technologies is probably what's most exciting. But I guess I should apologize in advance for this question. To me, I guess I wonder if the idea of tokenization, or tokens as rewards for volunteering as part of a campaign, is fundamentally sort of inimical to the sort of authentic investment that campaigns have traditionally thrived on, right? And as someone who has not really worked in campaigns before, other than, occasionally as a volunteer, I think I idealistically hold on to this idea that there's something really important to that sort of authentic civic engagement that isn't about being rewarded, but it's about trying to be part of the polity. Do we think that if we replace that with a system where there are no more volunteers, but rather just people who are compensated for, that we lose something sort of fundamental to democratic life?
Yeah, Scott, I think that's an interesting point that I've wrestled with a lot myself, but I hate to say it's already happening in its analog version, where piloted a couple cycles ago, but most notably in 2020 and definitely going to have a bigger presence in 2022, is the concept of paid relational organizing, where you offer stipends to volunteers who don't have the time to sort of work or volunteer for free, but you empower them, you give them the resources and sort of the network to go and advocate in their own communities. So I will say maybe 10 years ago, almost every volunteer was kind of doing it for free for those reasons that I described, but that's very much changed as of now. So, understanding that, it makes the tokenization aspect of it kind of a little less hard to swallow, since, understanding in the analog version, people are genuinely being paid for their time and service to the campaign. And, it creates an atmosphere in which people who otherwise wouldn't be able to get involved can then do so. So I think that's one positive of it. But yes, I also sort of share the kind of love of the civic passion that people have to go out and knock on doors in their spare time on their, and on weekends. And I don't think that the program that I described should ever kind of replace that. It should only enhance it.
I would also say, I think the version of it that or the side of it that appeals a lot to me, maybe it's like the engineer in me that's just like, we need the information, is having it be a record, right? Like, what if it's all of your volunteer activity just somehow manifested as like metadata, right? And it's your choice as to who you want to share that with, or whether you sort of make it open to your larger, national party that wants to sort of tap into these resources. But how do we turn this into a really easy way for people to get engaged in the types of things that want to see, right? Like, we're relying, for example, when I was first getting involved, just volunteering for campaigns even, I was relying on groups like Swing Left to sort of show me the way and say, here are the races to pay attention to. If you're going to give your money and time, and if you're going to call voters, if you're going to go and show up door knocking somewhere, I needed someone to curate that for me. I needed someone to kind of tell me what to do, because there are way too many things happening across the country that I could even pay attention to, or figure out what the most important races were as like someone coming out of college, right? And so how do we make that easier? How do we say, here are my values, here are the things that I care about, how can I make the most impact, and how can we leverage Web3 to engage you, to make that on-ramp smoother, and to reward you when you've done a good job? So I think there are ways that we can really leverage Web3 to just, I don't think anyone who works in politics will say there's like efficiency in any of these systems. And I think that's something that Web3 can be pretty good at, is by actually introducing efficiency and streamlining a lot of this.
I think one of the big values of Web3 in politics, Scott, is going to be that identity and that record keeping. Ironically enough, of knowing who you are and that you are who you say you are. We are seeing a trend sort of broadly away from strong centralized parties to candidates have more control, and then as a result, certain firms or agencies within the party have access to key infrastructure, and Web3 is going to, I hope, put that back in the hands of voters. And so rather than plugging into like a strong central campaign, the records are just out there for people to plug into. And so ironically, I think it's going to be the identity and knowing, hey, I do live in this district. I've got experience on these 4 software platforms. I don't need to do a training. Just give me a walk list. You can also put me on your paid relational staff and get some more efficiency out of these campaigns. Because I think for people who haven't been on a campaign, one of the most frustrating aspects is we spend, the first several months of any campaign calling the same people who worked on the campaign last time to see if they'll work on this campaign. They need to be asked. They want to be asked. That's part of what they get from a campaign. But we can make that process more efficient, more effective.
And I will say, obviously, as a younger person myself, it helps more candidates enter the fray, right? If you have more established infrastructure that you can tap into, you're not having to build it all from scratch. You're able to come in and say, hey, look, here are the things that I stand for. Let's hit the ground running. And why am I having to sort of scramble between all of these different groups to just get my hands on even, last campaign's volunteer list, right? And so I do think it also will freshen up the political scene a little bit by actually making it a bit easier for new entrants.
Great. Okay, so we have 15 minutes left, and I want to reserve some time for Q&A. But first, as promised, I want to go back to this question that Shrina raised at the beginning about regulation, about the regulatory sort of situation as it stands. So, what do y'all think is the best path forward here? Right, there's been a great deal of debate about crypto regulation. What are the sorts of regulations that y'all want to see that would help sort of encourage the healthy development in this space?
Just very simply, just regulatory clarity always helps. I think that's that would be a huge capital WIN. Like we just want clarity to figure out how we can actually operate in this space. And I think that's the certainty around what it means to be involved in Web3 is something that would help everyone know how to build in Web3. So without getting into any specifics, I think just regulatory clarity is a big part of this. I think from the fundraising side, to be honest, I don't think much is going to change from everything that I understand. And Russell and Eric, please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. But the FEC is sort of given a wobbly thumbs up, right, to NFTs and crypto. And we have been able to accept Bitcoin contributions. We have actually been able to take crypto in campaigns for a while now. This isn't just this cycle. And with NFTs, really positioning it as effectively just an online contribution, the way you might purchase swag on a website. I think that's, where the whole digital collectible piece comes in. You're now just buying an NFT online, right? And that's it. That's all we're going to call it. We're not going to, talk about returns. We're not going to talk making money off of it. Like the same way you might want to take your original Obama poster and sell it on, Craigslist or eBay. Sure, you can go ahead and do that. You might make a bunch of money off of it, but that's completely on you. We're not saying that any value is going to increase or anything like that. This is just your way of you make a campaign contribution. Here's your NFT. Thank you. So I think from the funding side, I think we sort of have what we need to a certain extent. I think having the FEC or some body that people trust come out and say that, I think would probably help people not have to worry about, is this legal? Is this not? How can I do this? It's also something that I'm kind of just like quietly working on as like a little guidebook of what we did just to make it easier for other folks to do. And I think Electables and other platforms like that are also trying to help there. But I think from the fundraising side, we kind of have what we need. And from the campaign and getting volunteers and engagement, all the stuff we just talked about, I don't think from that side that we really need to see any regulatory changes. I do think that regulatory certainty more broadly will help more people feel like crypto is okay. And it's something that is not illegal, is not scary, is not a scam, and it's something that they should trust the same way that we no longer wonder if it's safe to be online. Like, sure, I think some people do wonder if it's safe to be online, but for the most part, we've all sort of agreed like being on the internet is an okay thing to do, right? So I think if we can take it in that direction of engaging with blockchain technology is an okay and safe thing to do. And if we can get 2 thumbs up from the federal government, I think that would actually help adoption.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. And I agree that it is sort of a wobbly thumbs up from the FEC. Well, at least in terms of crypto donations, it's been happening since 2014, but the only real guidance is a 2014 advisory opinion, which is just a statement of policy. It isn't like an official, regulation. To that end, I don't think that anything there will change in the near future. The only thing that might change is that double thumbs up, which would be helpful. And on the NFT side of things, it's sort of in the same vein. The one thing that I worry about there is, a group of candidates who pilot NFTs without the infrastructure of, a platform like Electables, who might not necessarily be doing it in the most rigid way in terms of contribution requirements, reporting requirements, and the whole concept of anonymity and resale value, where if you don't sort of have a KYC wall, then it's very possible you could have contributions from people who aren't American citizens, who are under the age of 18, or who for a single candidate have already went over their same cycle sort of donation limit. So that's a concern there. And especially as you think about candidates who might offer NFTs on OpenSea, where you're able to buy and sell them on the secondary market, there's no KYC mechanism at all. That's not necessarily a regulatory issue, something that the federal government would have to sort of intervene in. It's something for candidates to be aware of so they don't get in trouble and have to refund contributions on the back end.
And as a quick piece on that, like it's the same with campaign contributions. If you put your campaign bank account number on your website and people just started sending you money, you would face the same issue. And that's effectively what you're doing with NFTs is you're providing a wallet address and you're saying, send me money, but you have to put that wall up first and say, yes, send me money, but are you over the age of 18? Are you a citizen? You know, give me your address. So all of those pieces have to be in place, which is why, for example, platforms like OpenSea actually don't work. But it's the same thing if someone just decides to swing by your, you know, campaign office and drop off $5,800, you know, what do you do with it, right? So I think you face the same things with cash, with online contributions as well. We just have more established platforms that allow candidates to access, you know, for example, through ActBlue, like we know how that's done. It collects all the information. We have the reporting. We're all good. And that infrastructure just doesn't yet exist when it comes to Web3.
Eric, is there anything you want to add as far as the regulatory question?
No, I don't think I don't have anything to add. I think everyone pretty much covered it.
Great. Cool. Okay, so let's turn to audience Q&A. So we've already gotten a couple questions about privacy, kind of from different sides. So one person asks, or Elliot Singara asks, could you potentially see a use for blockchain technology to address privacy concerns with data privacy in transactions? And then Jake asked a similar question, are political organizations that adopt Web3 and decentralized tech taking data privacy of voters, donors, and volunteers into account? What does ownership of data look like? So is Web3 a potential solution to privacy concerns, and how might we think about privacy as it relates to integrating these technologies? Any of you all want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I think one of the principles that we're seeing in data privacy is this opt-in, this granting permission. And I think blockchain can be a really helpful way for maintaining the ledger of who has given permission, what have they given permission for, what pieces of data. And that could be a really good tool to bring that in line. I think a lot, campaigns are short-term organizations. I think they want to reach as many voters as they possibly can. That's why using old email lists, old volunteer lists is so prevalent. And I think if volunteers, voters, individual supporters can take back some of that control, that would be a pretty powerful opportunity to secure that privacy. I do think there's still going to be voter files out there, and we're still going to need to know who those people are. So it's really a matter of like what's the right balance, and how do people get back that control.
I think it also really depends on what your issues are, right? Like for me personally, my biggest issue is that I am on every Democratic candidate's email list for fundraising. And that's the main concern that, I personally have, right? But that Web3 is not changing that, right? Like that's going to continue to exist. I'm going to keep getting added to more lists, and I'm going to keep giving certain people money, and that's just going to make things worse. So that's not something that Web3 is going to challenge, right? And so I think it really depends on what your issues are and what you're currently taking issue with the system. But I think to Eric's point, the voter file is still going to exist. Like this is not going to sort of rip and replace existing election technology. This is just going to augment it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And going back to Eric's earlier point about sort of a marketplace where you can approve what aspects of like your data profile you'd like to share with campaigns. That's one possible way where people could have more ownership over their data, and in turn more privacy because they have some consent over who gets it and where it goes. But I see that as an application that's sort of much further along down the road, when a lot of that data is stored on chain, which right now it's just associated with your general profile that a campaign might have on you based on your voting history, donation history, and address and location and phone number. So I do think that to some extent it is something that Web3 can do and has done for organizations, but is something way further along for the political and social impact space.
Yeah, we just got basically the same question from two different people. So Spencer writes, if a candidate is raising funds in a Web3 wallet, their incoming and outgoing transactions are transparent. And then as for the panel, how do you think candidates exploring Web3 campaign funding will feel about this type of transparency?
So at least on the federal level, your campaign contributions are also fully transparent, and to the extent where it's even more transparent because you can see the person's name associated with the amount that they gave to you, and that is all completely public information. So I don't think that really changes anything, to be honest. And in a sense, yes, there is the ledger that's sort of documenting the incoming and outgoing transactions, but it's not associated with a person. And so in a sense, it's actually at least less clear as to who's actually making those contributions. But I think it changes nothing in terms of transparency. If someone's using that as a talking point, it doesn't mean anything.
Great. We just got our donation speculative assets. Thoughts?
I don't want to create new regulations for anyone, but I mean, I think that it is, right? It's just like, you're donating in the hopes of shaping a campaign, and well, I think going back a little bit in our conversation, what motivates people to be involved or support a campaign? There are some people who just really like having that photo with the politician, and they like the recognition when they go to their county party. They're the people who are trying to build their resume, want to run for office themselves someday. Then there are the donors who have business before those elected officials. And so there are a lot of different motivators. And so I guess it's speculative, right? So you're more likely to donate to someone who's going to win, or you're donating because your boss is hosting a fundraiser, whatever those cases may be. So interesting thought experiment, but I don't know if it needs to be its own asset class.
Great. Well, we just have a couple of minutes left. So unless anyone has anything that they really want to, I guess I'll ask. So is there anything else that we haven't had a chance to talk about? Interesting ideas in this space that you just think we really want to make sure that we touch on?
I think we covered a lot. I mean, if the future could be, when we were talking about identity, Eric, like if your vote could be on chain, I think that's a potential, that's the future. But I think that's the only thing we haven't specifically mentioned.
I don't know how you resolve a public ledger with a private vote. I don't know how to square that circle, but people smarter than I are probably working on it. I think, for those who are building in the Web3 space, the more you can make these tools just fade into the background where it's just part of the web, the sooner they get adopted. We have learned from other industries that I think are touching on far less regulated sectors that you enforce good behaviors before they get enforced on you. And I think Shrina correctly pointed this out. The people who are going to be making those regulations have no idea what they're talking about. So it's just sort of a plea to, I guess, just be normal.
Great. Well, we can end there unless Russell, you had any final. Great. Well, thank you so much, all three of you. This has been just fascinating to hear your thoughts on this topic. And to the guests, thank you all for coming. And please keep an eye out for future events from the Decentralized Future Council. As I said, we'll be doing events like this pretty regularly from now on. So, all right. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.